Now, you've had a chance, have you, to have a look at these what they're being called antisocial reforms for social housing. What are your thoughts broadly? Is it fair to the minister was saying this is about making people's houses safer for everybody, and if those who are misbehaving miss out and get evicted, well, then that's too bad for them.
No. So, Melinda, yeah, we have had an opportunity to have a look at this bill, and we do hold some serious concerns about what this means for public and social housing tenants in our region and across the state. Yes, it's being marketed as a antisocial and a necessary management tool to address those issues of antisocial behaviour and criminal activity. However, there's already legislation in place, and that legislation is sufficient and already provides just outcomes. And there's safeguards in place, and there's oversight which ensures that just outcomes are reached. This bill proposes to strip a lot of the discretion out of the tribunal, which places public and social housing tenants at great risk, which is even more important considering that those tenants are already amongst the most vulnerable in our community.
The government does say, and I don't know the details of this, but they do say that a recent survey of public housing tenants found that the majority of them think that antisocial behaviour is a problem in social housing, and I'm assuming if they think it's a problem, that it's one that they'd like to have fixed. I mean, if that's the case, are these measures justified?
No, I mean, our service absolutely acknowledges that there are social problems that come with public and social housing. Indeed, to get into social and public housing to start with, you need to have a litany of complex issues that you're facing. Often that involves mental illness, poor education, long-term unemployment, family breakdown. All those things tend to lead to problems such as antisocial behaviour and criminal activity. That said, there is, as I said before, there is legislation in place that already allows the housing providers to manage those types of behaviours and those activities. Unfortunately, in our experience, it's still not managed well. But what they're trying to do now is put legislation in place that relieves them of having to manage it and just go to the tribunal and ask it for eviction orders.
Well, it was interesting, this notion of the one strike policy for people who seriously breach their tenancy agreement. The minister seemed to be saying that if someone is charged with a serious crime, usually an indictable offence, so things like serious assault, child sex assault, some serious drug offences, then he was talking about the civil and administrative tribunal having to come up with some sort of, on the balance of probabilities assessment of whether the person who's been charged is guilty of that crime or not before they've been found guilty in a court. Is that your reading of it?
Yeah. And look, we see these types of issues come to our service quite a lot. You know, it's not unusual for us to hear from clients that have been somehow affected by some kind of illegal activity or antisocial behaviour in their property. Now, but the issue here is that that's not always the fault or the activity of the tenant. So take, for example, tenants who have a wayward son who is selling drugs from the property. Under the current legislation, if that came before the tribunal could exercise its discretion and say, well, termination is not appropriate because the tenants weren't themselves involved in the activity. They weren't aware of the activity, and the son has been rightly punished through the criminal system. Under the proposed bill, those tenants, those parents, would be facing homelessness as a result of the son's activity.
Yeah, these are all, I guess there are plenty of case studies that could be raised. It's very difficult to know how it would actually play out, given if there's a conviction, I don't know, would the son in that instance, if their name is not on the lease, I'm sure the government can't force the son to not live with the parents.
No, that's right. And so the current legislation, a named tenant is vicariously liable for the behaviour of their guest or their visitors or their additional occupants. So whatever your guest or your additional occupants do, you are also guilty of. But the legislation has those safeguards in place currently where the tribunal can look at those situations and make a decision on whether or not the named tenant ought to be facing homelessness as the result of the behaviour of a guest or an additional occupant. The bill in its current form removes that discretion and places families and victims of domestic violence and the like at great risk of homelessness.
What about this 3 strikes policy so that family and community services officials can evict someone or terminate their lease, I suppose, if the tenant receives 3 breach of tenancy agreement notices in 12 months? Surely that's fair enough. If you're in the private rental market and you breach your tenancy agreement, you wouldn't be given 3 chances in a year, would you?
Well, absolutely. Currently under the legislation, there is no difference between a social housing tenant and a tenant in the private market. Their rights are precisely the same. And so if there is a breach of your tenancy and it's a breach that justifies termination, then the tribunal can, and they regularly do, make termination orders. What this new 3 strikes policy is proposing is that if there's a breach which doesn't justify termination, we'll give you a notice. And then if you do it again, or another breach which doesn't justify termination, we'll give you another strike notice. And then on the 3rd occasion, we take you to the tribunal. Now, the bill proposes that unless you raised any opposition to those strike notices, then the allegations become conclusive proof in the tribunal. So it relieves the social housing provider of actually having to prove their claim, prove the allegation. It simply says, we've given them a couple of warnings, they didn't respond to it. That must mean that they admit to the allegation.
Just finally, Warren Wheeler, I mean, with thousands and thousands of people on the waiting list for social housing, the minister does make the point that when so many people try to do the right thing and most are good tenants, why should bad tenants be allowed to continue living in a place that is desperately needed by thousands of other people?
Yeah. It's not about pitting good tenants versus bad tenants, I mean, at the end of the day, if all this legislation does, and this is all I can see it doing, is just increasing the rate of homelessness. All it does is pushes more people out onto the street with nowhere to go and allows more, that might free up a property for someone else who then faces the same issues because of those ongoing problems, because of those social disadvantages that they are facing. There is a high risk that they too will come under fire and they too will become victim of this bill.
Okay, Warren Wheeler, thanks very much for your time this morning.
Okay, thank you, Mel.